It's one thing to deploy eugenics on ideological, political, or moral grounds. It's quite another to conclude that it wouldn't work in practice. Of course it would. It works for cows, horses, pigs, dogs, and roses. Why on earth wouldn't it work for humans? Facts ignore ideology. Well, that quote from Richard Dawkins is completely correct. Eugenics works. Changing genetic populations works. Controlling genes within a population works. You can objectively, selectively breed animals for certain traits. When you selectively breed a population for a trait, that is known as eugenics. I can't really see how anything about this would be controversial. Oh god, he said it on Twitter, didn't he? This of course led to several pseudo-intellectual hacks who know nothing about genetics coming out of the woodwork, demanding that Dawkins define what exactly works or would work means. And other people proved his point while trying to disagree with him, saying things such as this. While Richard Dawkins is a noted biologist, his science on eugenics is bad. We turned magnificent wolves into pure-breed dogs with several genetic defects, causing joint and heart problems and cancer. In fact, many Cavalier Spaniels develop mitral valve and neurological disorders. Eugenics does not create superior species. We turned mighty buffalo herds roaming the plains into factory-farmed cows, the independent stallion into the pony, and the wild boar into the pig. We weaken the gene pool selecting for traits desirable for us, but not for the subjects. All of these supposed rebuttals actually prove that eugenics works. We took animals which were one particular way and bred them selectively to be another way. The fact that we did so in a way which could be considered weakening to the gene pool of that animal is irrelevant. It was in fact those weakened states that we wanted the animals to be in. For the record, it wasn't actually the buffalo that we turned into cows. Modern cows are a descendant of the auroch. Over many centuries of selective breeding, these aurochs were made smaller and more docile. Thus, they became what we now know today as the modern cow. Incidentally, about the modern cow, we have several types of cow, most notably the dairy cow and the beef cow. Historically, this difference was a lot less pronounced, in some cases not even existing. The reason that we now have dairy cows and beef cows is because we have selectively bred them, otherwise known as applied eugenics to the population, so that some cows now produce larger volumes of milk for longer periods, and other cows produce muscle mass which is more suitable for eating than they would otherwise. For instance, the meat of a dairy cow is now considered to be inferior to the meat of a beef cow. This entire difference is because of selective breeding. Selective breeding is a form of eugenics. Hell, we have looked at eugenic practices on this channel before, in our videos where we talked about guppies and brain sizes relative to body sizes. You may recall that the researchers of those experiments started with one population of guppies. They then divided this population into two populations. They picked guppies which had large brain-to-body sizes and another population which had a small brain-to-body size. They then bred these two populations together and continued this pattern onwards for several generations. This gave them, for their research, two distinct populations. One with a very large brain-to-body size, which also featured a smaller gut, and one population with a small brain-to-body size. This pattern of selective breeding was a form of eugenics, and it worked. The researchers wanted an outcome, they controlled the genes of the population, and they got that outcome. So to the pseudo-intellectual hacks out there who are talking in sound bites so that they can claim that they totally pwned some scientist on Twitter so that they can feel really smart about themselves for having achieved nothing in their own lives, when they're asking, how does eugenics work? What is works? What is this idea of eugenics working? Yes, eugenics works. Controlling population genetics works. Selective breeding works. Eugenics is merely the term used for selective breeding when we apply it to humans. Now, the term eugenics is very loaded. There has been a very checkered history, you could say, around the term eugenics and around its usage. For instance, it has been advocated by supremacist groups as a means of improving a population, as a means of encouraging other people that they considered undesirable to not breed. However, this is blaming the tool for the actions of the user. The fact that someone may use a tool for a nefarious end does not prove that that tool does not work. For instance, someone could use an axe to murder someone. That doesn't mean that an axe is not a suitable tool for splitting wood. Dawkins even clarified this in a further post. For those determined to miss the point, I deplore the idea of a eugenic policy. I simply said deploring it doesn't mean it wouldn't work. Just as we breed cows to yield more milk, we could breed humans to run faster or jump higher. But heaven forbid that we should do it. Of course, trying to explain things to a bunch of outrage merchants who are only capable of thinking in 140 characters is a wasted endeavour. As one person responded, "So unacceptable for Richard Dawkins to tweet about eugenics without clearly condemning it. Dawkins is supposedly one of our exemplars of humanism and science outreach, yet today he's given every manner of passive and active bigot an opening to consider persecution on steroids." This blue checkmark then of course proving that they are incapable of reading what Dawkins just said. And so the outrage moved on and spread and spread and spread. So this leaves the question open. Can we actually breed humans to be better? Well, the answer is yes, and now I'm going to prove why. And I'm going to put the disclaimer here, as if the previous several minutes of this video wasn't enough. Just because I am demonstrating that something is possible, that does not mean that it should be done. Just because you can do something, that doesn't mean you must, or that you should, or that it is even a good idea to. So Dawkins mentioned that we could breed humans to run faster. Okay, well, what does it mean to run faster? What are the variables that go into human speed? Fortunately for us, this is something that has been studied in papers such as this one. Factors affecting the energy cost of level running at sub-maximal speed. This study looks at the variables that go into humans and how they run. Taking into account variables such as the metabolic demand, that is the amount of energy that it requires to go a certain distance, or looking at the energy demand for a given running speed. And it finds that there are other variables that are very important to this, such as body dimensions, things like body mass, leg architecture, specifically calcaneal tuberosity length. That's one of the bones in the foot, it's basically the heel bone. And that was responsible for about 60 to 80% of the variability in this particular study. There have of course been other studies, such as this one, biomechanics and running economy. The summary of which is quite illuminating. I will just read it through verbatim and it'll give you an idea of all of the variables that are at play here. Running economy, which has traditionally been measured as an oxygen cost of running at a given velocity, has been accepted as the physiological criterion for efficient performance and has been identified as a critical element of overall distance running performance. There is an intuitive link between running mechanics and energy cost of running, but research to date has not established a clear mechanical profile of an economic runner. It appears that through training, individuals are able to integrate and accommodate their own unique combination of dimensions and mechanical characteristics so that they arrive at a running motion which is most economical for them. Information in the literature suggests that biomechanical factors are likely to contribute to better economy in any runner. A variety of anthropometric dimensions could influence biomechanical effectiveness. These include average or slightly smaller than average height for men and slightly greater than average height for women, high ponderal index, that's height to weight, and ectomorphic or ectomesomorphic physique, low body fat percentage, leg morphology, which distributes mass closer to the hip joint, narrow pelvis, and smaller than average feet. Gait patterns, kinematics and kinetics of running may also be related to running economy. These factors include stride length, which is freely chosen over considerable training time, low vertical oscillation of body center of mass, more acute knee angle during swing, less range of motion but greater angular velocity of plantar flexion during toe-off, arm motion of smaller amplitude, low peak ground reaction forces, faster rotation of shoulders in the transverse plane, greater angular excursion of the hips and shoulders about the polar axis in the transverse plane, and effective exploitation of stored elastic energy. Other factors which may improve running economy are lightweight but well-cushioned shoes, more comprehensive training history, and the running service of intermediate compliance. The thing that you'll have noticed most about a lot of these variables is that most of them are biological, and a lot of these biological ones are genetically inherited. For instance, when you look at things like stored elastic energy, this is something which tendons in your legs are very good at. That's why when you look at running or hopping animals, things like ostriches or kangaroos, you'll see that their lower legs are almost entirely tendon. That's because when they move, when they run, when they bounce, they stretch these tendons out, and then like a big elastic band, those tendons shorten again, which propels them forward. In humans, how long the tendon is in your calf, this is something which in humans is very heavily genetically informed. You can't train yourself to have infinitely more tendon to make running more efficient. Sure, you can train the muscle and the tendon to a degree, but at some point you will hit a biological wall at which point it cannot improve. And if there are people out there who have tendons which are better at storing and releasing energy than yours, if all things are equal, they are going to outperform you for no other reason than genetics. This is why the previous study notes the superiority of black African runners is presumably related to their leg architecture and better elastic energy storage and reuse. And if you take an honest look at Olympic-level athletes when it comes to running, it's very hard to ignore the preponderance of black African runners. So this brings up an obvious question. How much of this is genetic and how much of it is due to training and nutrition and all of these other environmental factors? Well, as with a lot of other things, this has been studied, and it's been worked out that about 60 to 80% of the difference in height between people is determined by genetic factors, and about 20 to 40% can be attributed to environmental effects, most of which is nutrition. Now, height is all well and good, but what about legs? Well, unfortunately, playing around with people's legs in a genetic way is somewhat illegal. We can't just take human embryos and do all sorts of genetic testing on them. That's illegal. We can, however, do it to animals. And we do, all the time. You may remember from a few years ago there was a wave of clickbait articles about how scientists have turned a chicken into a dinosaur. Well, obviously that was a gross oversimplification in order to get people to click on articles so that these retarded websites could get ad revenue. What was actually being looked at was the ratio difference in length between the tibia and the fibula. Long story short, there are genes which influence when these bones start and stop growing. In chickens, it's one way, and in their dinosaur ancestors, it was another. And so by playing with the genes of a chicken, these scientists were able to effectively switch this growth around. So this chicken now ultimately has dinosaur legs when it comes to the bones and how long they are and what the ratio is between the tibia and the fibula. It's quite a lot more boring than the clickbait made it sound, but it proves the point. There are genes that influence bone length in your legs, and as has been previously established, leg architecture, or how your legs are formed, has quite a big impact on how they function. Now, to deal with the straw man argumentation which is going to follow, because it always does, people saying things like, "Oh, Teal there thinks people are genetically amazing runners and therefore you should never try because it's all genetically determined." No. People who have really good running genetics can quite easily never take up running because they don't like it, they don't want to run, they have no interest in it, and people who are genetically disadvantaged when it comes to running can very easily become good runners just by lots of hard work and exercise. But when it comes down to absolute peak performance, the kind of which we see at the Olympics, those genetic differences are going to come to the surface because you're dealing with such high thresholds of performance. Stating that one or two or a few gene variants may give you an advantage in one area is not saying that all other gene variants shouldn't ever bother trying to improve themselves. Take a bodybuilding example. We're going to look at tendons again, and this is a big one because it's the one that all bodybuilders love, the bicep and the bicep tendon. Your bicep length is predetermined by your genetics. How long the muscle is compared to how long the tendon is genetics. You can't change that. Not without absurd surgical intervention that doesn't even bear thinking about. What this means is when you lift a lot of weight and your bicep muscle gets very big, the peak of where your bicep is going to be different depending on whether you have a long muscle belly with a short tendon or a short muscle belly with a long tendon. This is something which is frequently lamented by people on bodybuilding forums who have short muscles and long tendons getting a better peak, because when they build that particular muscle, it can only really go up because there's not a lot of horizontal space for it to expand upon, whereas people who have shorter tendons and long muscle bellies tend to lament the fact that they have to do more work in order to build their bicep peak up because they've got a longer length of muscle. Now, in this particular example, we're looking at something that is purely aesthetic. Another one is abdominal muscles. Some people have really symmetrical abdominal muscles, and some people have what is colloquially referred to as zipper abs because their abs and tendons are all offlined on either side, so it looks like a zip. These things are genetically determined. You can't really do a whole lot about them environmentally. You can grow the muscle, absolutely. You can atrophy the muscle if you'd like. You can stretch the muscles and the tendons to improve their range of motion, or you can not do that and let their range of motion naturally decay. But you're not going to change where and how the muscle and tendon connect to each other. Another important factor when it comes to overall fitness is the VO2 max, which is the volume of oxygen that your body can uptake and use when at exercise. And surprising absolutely no one, when we do genome studies regarding oxygen uptake, we find that there are genes that influence that as well. As with everything we've previously mentioned, this isn't saying that if you have certain genes that are associated with a higher VO2 max, that your VO2 max will be higher than any other person's. After all, you have to train very hard to reach your VO2 max, you have to train very hard to push it back further. And trained individuals, even with all the genetics working against them, will almost certainly outperform untrained individuals who have every so-called genetic advantage. But this fact does not remove the fact that some people have a genetic advantage when it comes to attaining a VO2 max. And once again, when we look at very high-level scenarios, such as Olympic athletes, it wouldn't be surprising if certain gene markers that are associated with a higher VO2 max were more prominent. And since this is something which is bred into people, it is as a result of breeding, you absolutely could select for that trait if you wanted to. Take this point with everything that we've previously looked at. Leg architecture is something which is influenced by genetics. VO2 max influenced by genetics. If you put two people in an identical environment, but one of them had all of these genetic advantages and the other one didn't, the one with the genetic advantages, all other things being perfectly equal somehow, that person would outperform the person without those genetic advantages. When Dawkins points out that you can breed people to be faster runners, he is absolutely correct. From a theoretical, hypothetical standpoint, It is 100% within the realms of possibility. In other words, eugenics would work. And that statement does not depend on how you define work, or depend what you mean by working, or any other pseudo-intellectual, semi-philosophical bollocks like that. You can objectively work out genes which are linked to certain traits, and then encourage those genes to be reproduced within a population. People have been doing this with animals for millennia in the form of selective breeding. You don't even need to know what gene is responsible for what in order to selectively breed a population. Simply breed things together and work out how many of their offspring have whatever trait it is, take a note down of those numbers, and you can work it out based purely on percentages. Going back to some of the pseudo-intellectual, semi-philosophical non-arguments from people who don't understand what genetics is, people who believe in eugenics as if eugenics is some mystical outside force like a god that no one can truly quantify, as opposed to what it is, the objective study of genetics and how prevalent certain alleles are within populations, and the ability to manipulate allele frequency within populations. This does not require you to believe that you are some sort of superior kind of human being. You can recognize that certain genes have certain impacts on an organism. You can recognize that some of those impacts may be beneficial for that organism. You can then recognize that other organisms may benefit from sharing that trait, and that if more organisms did share that trait, then that species as a whole would be more suited to a certain environment. None of this requires that you believe yourself to be some sort of genetic Superman who is just better than everything else in the universe. Ironically, people who make the dysgenic argument, that is the argument that is the opposite of eugenics, that certain selective breeding practices have been harmful to animal species, rather amusingly, this argument relies on eugenics. It relies on there being a position of genetic superiority in order for there to be a position of genetic inferiority. You can't have dysgenics without eugenics. The fact of the matter is that human beings engage in a very loose form of eugenics all the time, and this comes down more to how one would define eugenics. Mate preference is by itself a eugenic decision, at least in part. You are attracted to someone because of who they are, and part of who they are is their genes. Facial symmetry, for instance. Facial symmetry is always considered to be attractive. Obviously, the person has to be attractive to begin with, but facial symmetry is a part of overall facial attractiveness. Facial symmetry is, you guessed it, partially genetic. You like someone's hair color? Genetic. You like someone's eye color? Genetic. You like someone's skin color? Genetic. Obviously, we have ways of manipulating these things. People can dye their hair, they can wear colored contact lenses, they can tan their skin, but none of these environmental impacts removes what is there at base. Even if you want to throw physical attractiveness completely out of the window and state that you only care about people because of their mind, that's the only thing you find attractive. Well, intelligence, again, partly genetic. General evidence of heritability of IQ, about 50 to 70%. People out there who believe IQ don't reals, it's not actually intelligence or any other non-arguments like that. This has been addressed several times across a number of decades. You are objectively wrong. There are several genes which have been directly linked to cognitive ability. There are other genes which are indirectly linked to cognitive ability. We may not have mapped all of it out absolutely 100% yet, but we are getting there. And that, of course, ignores the fact that you don't actually need to know exactly what gene is doing what in order for a gene to be doing something. As for eugenics as a topic, people have jerky knees, and I absolutely understand why. The propagandistic vision of the Aryan Superman, the Übermensch versus the Untermensch, still exists in people's minds and makes them very uncomfortable. The objective scientific fact that selective breeding works is a constantly warring force with the concept of human equality. If some people have genes that give them an advantage in some capacity and other people do not have those genes, then it could be said that there is no true equality between those two people, because there simply can't be. One is objectively at an advantage and the other is objectively at a disadvantage. Of course, this makes no allowance for environmental impact. As we previously mentioned, yes, there are genes which could, for instance, make someone a better runner. However, if they never run, and a person who has every genetic disadvantage does run, then the person who is genetically so-called inferior would end up as a better runner than the so-called genetic superior. And there are other very important variables to take into account: time and geography. An adaptation that may be advantageous in one location or in one time period may not be advantageous in another, or may even worse be disadvantageous in another time or location. As such, what is considered to be a best gene or a series of good genes may be entirely circumstantial. Of course, the biggest risk with any sort of eugenic policy or any sort of eugenic concept is the idea that it may be abused. That people may use eugenics and the objective truth of genetics and selective breeding to push for things which have nothing to do with the betterment of a gene pool. The disruption of a gene pool on the quest for so-called superior genes could lead to various problems, such as loss of genetic diversity, inbreeding depression, or long-term problems regarding immunity and species resilience to things such as widespread disease. Some of these things will be very difficult, if not impossible, to take into consideration, because, simply put, we don't know what's going to happen in however many 100 years' time. Ultimately, the question of eugenics is not a question of would it work. It absolutely would. It is a question of should we do it, and what would happen if we did do it. And the reality is that this is a conversation which is going to be forced back onto the table. The reason being that we live in a time of genome mapping and genome alteration. As such, eugenics is not going to be applied to an already existing population. It is something which is going to be done preemptively to the unborn. If you had your unborn baby genetically screened and you were told it had Down syndrome, would you terminate the pregnancy? If the answer is yes, you've just made a eugenic decision. What if you were told, instead of terminating the pregnancy, that you could remove the extra chromosome that's causing the problem? Again, that is a eugenic decision. What about the concept of so-called designer babies? The idea that in the future you may be able to choose the color of your children's eyes or the color of their hair. This is a eugenic decision. To people out there who doubt the validity of IQ as a valid indicator of people's intelligence, your own child could be born with genes that have been negatively correlated with IQ or genes which are positively correlated with high IQ. Which do you choose? At that point in time, I guarantee you every single one of them would become a eugenicist and say they want the genes that are correlated with high IQ. As our ability to map and influence genes improves, as we gain the ability to do this to people before they are even born, and as we move towards hypothetical technologies like the artificial womb, the ability to choose the genetics of your children is going to come back into the public light. So when it comes down to eugenics, the question is not, would it work? It absolutely, objectively would work. The question is, should it be done? How should it be done? And what is actually on the plate to be offered to people?